the psyche is social, it's relational, and that there are these different levels of communication going on, some conscious and some kind of less conscious. And really it's language that we're trying to get to. We're trying to have clearer and clearer communication. And at our deepest level of communication is archetype. So every word that we've ever spoken has been crafted over centuries by people. We're not kind of saying these words and these sounds by accident. Each word is actually attached to an object, in material reality. And we've kind of assembled, really, as long as society has been around or groups have been around, we've assembled stories together to make meaning. And so fairy tales are actually really, really old. They're not kind of invented by Disney or even the Grimm brothers. They're ancient, and they've been told in every group, in every society, in every land. And a lot of them are the same ones. So, Cinderella is repeated everywhere. Rumpelstiltskin's repeated everywhere. Chicken Licken is pretty repeated everywhere. Kind of stories that we wouldn't expect are just turn up. And so it's really kind of my interest in these sort of ancient, almost psychologies, people trying to make sense and meaning of the world and how we all relate to each other. And so just when I'm really listening to someone, just kind of what am I associating to? What storyline does this feel a bit like? Is part of why I'm so interested in fairy tales.
Hi, I'm Naomi Murphy, and this is the Locked Up Living podcast, where we talk with a wide range of people about harsh aspects of institutional life.
We also explore some of the ways to overcome them and to grow and develop. I'm David Jones. So join us every Wednesday morning, 6 o'clock UK time, for a fresh podcast.
So today you're going to hear from Dr. Libby Nugent, who's a clinical psychologist and group work practitioner of Group Psychoanalysis. She specialises in sexual health, complex trauma and group psychology. She has a long-standing interest in the need to connect with creative ways of thinking deeply about ourselves, each other, our society, and the many identities we live. And Libby, I really enjoy following you on Twitter because I think you post such interesting and very different kinds of posts on there. So it's always really nice to see what you've been tweeting about. So welcome. Really pleased to have you on.
Thank you for having me. I was delighted to receive the invitation. Actually, I thought this would be a really interesting conversation.
Hi, Libby. Great to meet you. So I'm David, by the way.
Hello.
So, Libby, why did you become a clinical psychologist? What was it that appealed to you about this role?
Oh, gosh. Well, I mean, it feels like a long time ago now, but I think really the answer that was true then and is true now is the people. I'd kind of got my degree in psychology and physiology and was a bit sort of lost, and but knew I kind of wanted to work in mental health, I think, somehow, but was more working in social services, and met two clinical psychologists in that work, Andrew Hyder and Andrew Vidgen, who I think are brilliant psychologists, actually. And conversations with them just really inspired me and opened this door into this whole new way of seeing the world and thinking about things. And I just wanted to join that group. I wanted to be a part of that somehow. And was really lucky that I was sort of invited in, really. I mean, obviously you have to do a bit of fighting too to get into clinical psychology, but yeah, that was the appeal of it. And just the way people see the world and how they want to contribute to it.
So what was the kind of thing they said to you that spurred your interest particularly?
Well, I think they were really trying to hold the complexity of people's situations. I was working in a day services in Cardiff, which was this closed environment where people with severe and enduring mental health problems could come. But, it was very much tea and toast kind of care. And they would occasionally have MDT meetings in the space. And it was a really beautiful service. I look back now, I think I had no business in that job, actually. I think I was a bit too young and naive for it. And there was maybe other people in the space that should have had it. But I got the job. And the psychologists, they would just be really interested in interactions, into kind of family stories, providing context around service users' experience, and just a really different way of understanding what was going on. That just felt just like a breath of fresh air, to be honest.
Yeah, I can see that. Yeah. So, I mean, I think I was similarly inspired by the first psychologist I worked with. There was a chap called David Kennard, who also completed his group analysis training while I was working with him.
Yeah. It's that kind of sibling experience, isn't it? Where you just think, when I grow up, I want to be like you. It's got that kind of feel to it. I probably still feel like that a little bit about them. But there's something about kind of somebody that isn't so far away that you think, oh, this is impossible. But at the same time, you've got a heck of a lot of legwork to be doing to kind of get in the same kind of game as them.
Well, I'm sure there's a book to be written about this, but of course the questions that are buzzing around in my mind is why then psychology rather than psychiatry?
Oh.
Well, that's all right. You don't have to answer that, because I think it's just a question that's come to mind, and it seems to me to be deeply interesting. And to me, it suggests something about the distance, from psychiatry to real lived experience at times.
Well, I suppose there's something about different paths into these sorts of conversations, aren't there? So I think, I started off actually studying medicine, believe it or not, and then switched to psychology. I do tend to take the long routes into things. And I think there's something very tribally different about psychiatrists and psychologists. And psychiatrists, I think the way in is very much the body and the physical, isn't it, in terms of that part of things. And psychologists tend to be more interested in the relational, in the social, in that part of things. And of course, I think we need both. But why one appeals to one person and not the other, I don't know. I'm not quite sure why I switched, really, either, maybe. But I don't know if I'd have carried on in medicine if I'd have done psychiatry. Who knows? It's kind of sliding doors.
Sorry. Yes, that's a bit of a sideways question. But you're now currently training in group analysis, aren't you? So why did you take that turn, and why is it of particular interest for you?
Well, I think my own experience of trying to understand myself, it's always lent itself to groups. I'm from a big family. I'm number 4 child out of 7 children. And I was, I grew up in a Mormon community, which is a sort of smaller community, obviously, in society. And I think and then left that community when I was in my teenage years. But I think I've just been really conscious of how much groups and the group experience has shaped my own well-being. And so from a very sort of personal level, wanting to understand myself a bit more, and groups kind of make sense to me from that. But I didn't go straight to group analysis. I don't think I was really kind of aware of anything to do with unconscious processes at all, actually. I think I was just more interested in systems and structures. And so my initial curiosities were very much around systemic psychology and narrative psychologies. And my thesis was on interprofessional collaboration in CAMS. And so that idea of kind of different tribes and how they kind of connect to each other over risk. But I think the unconscious part is just a natural kind of growing up. It's like, oh, actually, you do need a bit more than just kind of conscious understanding of what's going on. We do need to think about why when we do everything right, there's still problems and we still can't affect change and the stuckness remains. You know, what keeps happening that we need to kind of explore.
No, that's very interesting, isn't it? Because I think as time has gone on, there's a much wider acceptance of the mysteries of consciousness and unconsciousness, even if it's not phrased in analytic terms.
Yeah.
So do you think there's enough emphasis upon treating people in working in groups for mental health practitioners, or do we just assume that everyone can generalize their skills?
I think there is an assumption that the skills just transfer over. I think there might be a good amount of emphasis on groups in terms of people's desires to run them and their use in kind of service structures and things like that. I'm always curious to the idea that the theory and understanding of individual psychology and what we know about individual psychology, there's an idea that just maps straight over to a group experience. And some of it does, I think, really well. But a lot of it doesn't. And I think it's very easy to get into hot water. And the only reason why I say that is I think, you know, groups can be really quite dangerous places. And most people have had experience of a group being a kind of awful place, you know, whether it was a school classroom or a gardening club or some kind of, peer support place, that they can be incredibly powerfully supportive, but they can be really, really damaging as well. And that's not because of individual psychology, typically, although we do like to imagine, you know, we've got these strong personalities that just come in and ruin everything. Often it's a bit more complicated than that, I think. And so I suppose I'm a champion of this idea of yes, do group work, but please know a little bit more about group work. So it can be done safely, carefully, well.
In the same way we were talking about the kind of like whether people gravitate towards psychiatry or psychology at the start, I'm wondering if there's a question about whether people gravitate towards group work or individual work, and you know, whether some people might find themselves running groups because the service requires it, when maybe they don't have enough confidence in their own position in a group to be able to take that role comfortably.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I mean, I do think one way people try and run groups is to imagine their job is just lots of individual therapy all in the same room together. And of course, that kind of is part of it. You know, it is about individual need being addressed and strengthening. Actually, groups are about strengthening individuality, ironically, you know, that the better a kind of more able someone is to understand their own internal world and uniqueness, the more they contribute to a group and make a healthier group, a healthier society. But I think often people don't really harness the sort of sibling relationships in a group, you know, the lateral things that are kind of happening across the group. It can be very much focused on each individual group member patient with the group facilitator. And you know, of course, that's going to ignite all sorts of ideas about fairness and envy and lots of kind of maybe not so conscious patterns as well about what you do to get attention, you know, whether you deserve care or not over somebody else. And that's really tricky. You know, we've got quite ancient stories about sibling rivalry, and some of it gets pretty ugly. Although we also have lots of stories about sibling support as well, and how necessary it is to survival. So how do we harness the support and not just make people enact envy?
Thank you. I mean, you've already given some great ideas about what kind of happens or what may happen in groups, but what do you think are the important points of learning that you've taken from the training in relation to what groups do?
I mean, I'm still very much in the training, so I'm about 5 years in. It feels a bit never-ending, but so I don't know if I will be saying this when I'm on the other side of it, but currently I think the learning that I'm most kind of so I'm still very much in the training. So I don't know if I'll still kind of be thinking this at the end of it. But the learning that I'm most taking at the moment is really the need for planning, for really careful planning. I guess group analytically, you call that dynamic administration. But really having a sense of, what is the actual task of this group? How do you protect the space so it can happen? Fighting for a room, making sure there's enough chairs for people, making sure there really is space for people to be able to arrive comfortably, leave comfortably, navigating how long the group's going to last for. Is there parking outside? Is there easy access? It's all stuff that, in a dyad, in a one-to-one, you don't have to give that much attention to. Like, you really don't. You can probably make do with, it's not great, is it? But just any old room changing each week. You can probably, you can walk someone to the space. But if there's 5, 6, 7, 8 people in a group, you can't just walk each person to the room. You can't, you're going to get people getting lost. You're going to get confusion. There'll be different physical needs. People will be arriving in different emotional states. So this idea of just, I guess the metaphor is always preparing the nursery, which is a bit patronizing on one kind of sign. But there is a big difference between having one child and 8 children. You have to really plan very, very carefully. And you also have to plan very carefully about taking care of yourself as well, how much it actually takes to look after that number of people in a space, rather than you can do it a bit more on the hoof, I think, in a one-to-one situation. But I guess the more people in the room, the less you know what's going to come up. So you have to kind of really plan in for chaos a bit more, because it will arrive. It's just, you don't know when.
Thank you. So it sounds as if you're talking about thoughtfulness from the very beginning and paying attention to the setting and being prepared to be shaken oneself and coping with that.
Yeah, all of that.
Great. So do you think this training is useful even if you're not offering treatment predominantly in groups?
Yeah, I do actually. I think there's something about it that really has forced me to really notice how I prepare spaces, how I navigate beginnings and endings, how other people navigate them. It really encourages this slowing down and examining. Even if kind of my work from now on would only ever be kind of one-to-one, I think there's always kind of more people under the couch, aren't there? There's always more people in the room than we imagine. And so just having that insight and awareness of actually we are constantly kind of carrying our groups around with us, and that we need to make space for that. I think it's invaluable, actually.
Do you think it helps you with thinking about colleagues and management? I
think, well, it does. And I think the other thing that working in groups makes you realise is actually the humanity of each other. There's always so much going on behind closed doors, or different parts of the self that you didn't know. So you can be in a group therapy with someone for years, and then someone new joins the group, and all of a sudden you're hearing these brand new stories, brand new insights, and it's like, oh gosh, there's always so much more to people. And particularly in work, we kind of people come with these very strong personas, often their kind of professional identity. And it's so easy to imagine that that's the whole person. It's so easy to imagine that this thing that we thought they would never possibly think or never be possibly open to understanding or connect with, actually, really might be there somewhere. So it really softens our ability to relate as well to people, kind of to colleagues, and to really help with leadership in that as well, actually. Kind of seeing people as more whole.
Yeah, good points.
Yeah, as you were talking, I was just thinking about that idea of, as a qualified professional, as a psychologist, there's an expectation that you will take leadership roles as you progress throughout your careers, if that's in the NHS or whatever other organisation, with perhaps less emphasis on how you prepare for that. And as you were talking, I was thinking, even if your client work is predominantly not in groups, all that group work, process thinking is probably very useful in terms of thinking about the organisation, which is a mass of groups, isn't it? It's not just individuals that you're trying to relate with or think about, but how the organisation is composed of many different groups.
Yeah, I think so. I think that something really interesting happens when people progress into leadership roles that I don't think psychology training often prepares people for, and certainly one-to-one working doesn't prepare people for, which is that the more authority and power you hold in a system, the more visible you are to everybody, and the less visible everybody is to you. And so you just become this sort of figure that people will project things onto. And of course, in 1-to-1 or 2-to-1 or 3-to-1 or 4-to-1 even, that's fairly controllable. You can kind of have conversations around it, you can navigate it, but you get to a certain number and you really are just at the kind of mercy of the projections. And if you don't know that part of group process, that actually there's something very impersonal going on, it's very archetypal, that people aren't seeing you as a human being, and nor can they, or maybe should they. You're becoming some kind of god or monster to a lot of people, or a parent figure, and whatever that means. Then if you really might not know how to keep yourself safe in it, you might not know how to find care or resource. I find it fascinating that kind of leaders in psychology often have so little kind of protected time for reflection, so little protected time for self-care, and are so open to kind of other people's kind of gaze. And so it's quite frightening. It's quite frightening, and you can see why lots of people end up sick or having to leave, because I think it's one area that really group understanding is sort of necessary, actually.
As you were talking, I was also thinking about introverts and extroverts, and I think lots of psychologists and psychotherapists might be introverts and enjoy the one-to-one, the intimacy of a one-to-one interaction, but it's quite different when you're then plunged into a group situation where, as you say, you're automatically much more visible, and that might be more uncomfortable for people who are introverts than people who are extroverts, perhaps.
Yeah, I can see that. And it becomes, and again, well, maybe not again, but introverts, extroverts either can be great leaders. It's not kind of necessary to be one or the other. But I think that does add an extra weight for some people, that it's so uncomfortable and unfamiliar. But then you could say for the extrovert, that maybe they're used to kind of getting this thank you almost, or something that's much more kind of intimate in terms of being seen, and that's what they enjoy. And actually, if they're also getting a lot of the negative projections that will happen, which is inevitable, I mean, that can be devastating. So it's I don't think there's any winners in this particularly.
No, so what's that like then for service users, the clients, that when they're, sometimes group treatment is the only treatment. People, if you're in a prison, for instance, the vast majority of what you're going to be offered as psychological treatment is going to be delivered in a group. So what's that like? Presumably some people do fare better than others in group situations.
Yeah, well, I think people aren't always ready for a group situation. That it does require a certain amount of positive experience of groups. And some people really haven't had that, that groups have been very dangerous, terrifying places where they've had to come out fighting, where shame is just very, very readily available. And so it is important to be able to be in a group and be able to imagine at least, one or two faces in there are going to be on your side, or one or two faces are not going to be appalled or disgusted or devastated by your asking for something, needing something, mentioning something. And so, yeah, enforced groups is a bit tricky, isn't it, as a way. But they can be really beautiful spaces as well. So I guess it's complicated.
Well, absolutely. I'm just thinking about the service I worked in for 17 years in a high secure prison. We, all of the men who were referred to the project had to have been prevented from doing any other treatment in prison. And usually that was because they weren't willing to go to groups, or they'd acted out aggressively in groups, and so they'd been excluded from treatments. And we offered a combination of individual therapy and group therapy, and actually the attendance rate at individual therapy was around 95% from the start of being in treatment, which is very, very high, even though they could vote with their feet and not turn up. But group attendance often took a lot longer to get to. So I would say the first sort of 12 months, people were really quite in opposition to being in groups, even though group work started at the same time as their individual therapy. And the first year was very much a lot of hostility, with a group of 8 men, all probably who would have identified as being loners, saying, why would I want to sit in a group with any of these people? But by year 3 of treatments, the men would be talking about feeling a real sense of love and care, and saying, this is the first time in my life I've ever felt loved. And so you could see this transformation, and the group process was definitely an important part of that. And I think the fact that the groups were not structured groups either, so there wasn't an agenda of what had to be spoken about, but that experience of just being and existing in a room with 7 other men had this really powerful transformative role that it played for the men, I think, when their histories were of being socially marginalised, being the ones at school that were seen as being stupid or to be excluded, bullied, and were often excluded. So the group had a very powerful part to play in their treatment, I would say. David, you've probably seen that in the therapeutic communities that you've worked in.
I think that's right. Although my views on what constituted good therapy changed somewhat when I went to work at Grendon. So I came to believe over a period of time that one had to be aware that people always needed allies in their group. And I think you were hinting at that earlier on, Libby. And they also needed a sense of support from the facilitator. And so being a kind of opaque kind of interpreter of events, I didn't feel was particularly effective in that setting. You had to be much more accessible and transparent, really.
Yeah, that makes lots of sense to me, David. I think it really is quite a kind of worldview shift for people to see groups as this place of support. And I think that is really the role of the conductor, although obviously what is support then becomes kind of a massive question, doesn't it? But and what is, rather than kind of interference or kind of pushing a particular perspective onto someone. I think as well, in terms of structuring groups, groups are extraordinary at being able to get to shame and to care for people when they're being shamed. And shame is a social phenomena, so of course groups put it in, so it's groups that need to take it out. But to kind of set a group up so that can happen does need thinking about, in terms of who's in the group. It's important that, like you say, there aren't any isolates, people that have these experiences that no one else in the group has had, that just will go into the group and feel very different. So we do need some kind of pairings kind of to be thought about, or at least talked about if it's not possible. At the same time, there needs to be enough difference for new stories to get in, that it can't just be that everybody uses the same coping strategies or everybody has the same worldview. Or so you need this sort of tension of sameness and difference to really get this sort of caring matrix kind of ignited.
And I think, David, were you talking about I suppose, the more traditional analytic view being that you kind of like intervene very sparsely and may need to make interpretations, but actually when you've got a population who are much more frightened and anxious about being in a group anyway, perhaps needing more active thinking through more active presence from the facilitator than traditionally groups might run.
Yeah, I mean, I started off working in the NHS, and that was predominantly the style, what you just described. Yeah.
I was also, as we were talking, I suppose the other thing that we haven't spoken about is in groups, you might be running a group alongside another professional, and that might be the best model in order to meet the multiple need, to make sure that if somebody's being scapegoated, there is someone who's able to be there as an ally and support them, whilst the other person, because you have people attend groups, don't you, being really quite provocative, and they can't be entirely colluded with, but you might want somebody to be able to hold the compassion for them, whilst the other facilitator perhaps supports the people who are feeling quite affronted or offended, upset by what the person's had to say.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to be so to run a group. You really do need to know the context of the group that it's being run in. So does that make sense? So you need to know the context. It takes a group to run a group. So the group. In group analysis, you don't kind of think of systems as being closed. You see them as being open. And so there is this sort of borderland area where there's sort of corridor conversations or attached kind of individual sessions or other groups going on. And the idea isn't, that you're very mindful of the boundaries, but also that there's the crossing of a boundary, so somebody taking some material that happened in the group to an individual session, how does that get spoken about, and can it be spoken about, and how do you kind of link up the different places whilst being mindful of privacy and all the complexity that comes with it. But it's really important to kind of really know the context that a group sits in, so that group members can be supported, including the group conductor, the group facilitator.
And do we do enough thinking about group composition when we think about multidisciplinary teams, for instance, and when teams might be very well established with perhaps a very long-standing member of the team who then leaves and is replaced? And are we good enough at thinking through what that then means for that team of professionals who, if they're not functioning well together, might actually not make the best of decisions for the patients?
Yeah, I sort of smiled when you were talking then, Naomi. I think these are really difficult, kind of messy topics. How do we talk about that sort of feeling part of work? The the losses that we may feel really personally, actually, when someone we like or someone we didn't like kind of leaves the system. And you know, how does the team navigate that? And I guess the question is, well, should they even? You know, why can't people just have private thoughts and let them be private? And there's an argument for that, I think. But one of the difficulties is if you're in a team meeting and there's conversations happening, but you can't really kind of get to the group task of thinking about a patient situation because you're there just internally eye rolling every 5 seconds, or you're thinking, well, such and such a person would have never said that, or thank God I'm not having to listen to that old stuff that was being said before. And you're not really present in the conversation because you're so distracted by all these sort of feeling parts. You know, it does then become a problem. You know, these things that we don't want to be relevant really are. And I guess that's the kind of unconscious material, isn't it? You know, whether we like it or not, it kind of does get in the way. And we're not just machines that can switch off to the personal.
Yeah, I'm kind of wishing we'd had you on just to talk about groups today, because I think we could easily talk about this topic for much longer. But we also wanted to ask you something about the use of metaphors and storytelling, because that's, I think, very present in your tweets, where you often reflect interesting, fantastical perspectives on human psychology. Why are you so interested in fairy tales?
Well, to be honest, this is really connected to groups. It's not a separate topic. On a personal level, why do I like fairy tales? I just like them. I always have. Stories were a really important escape for me when I was little. I was a big fan of Highton Library and spent a lot of time there. You know, so there's that. But also from a kind of group level, in group analytic psychology, there's this idea that the psyche is social, it's relational, and that there are these different levels of communication going on, some conscious and some kind of less conscious. And really it's language that we're trying to get to. We're trying to have clearer and clearer communication. And at our deepest level of communication is archetype. So every word that we've ever spoken has been crafted over centuries by people. We're not kind of saying these words and these sounds by accident. Each word is actually attached to an object, you know, in material reality. And we've kind of assembled, really, as long as society has been around or groups have been around, we've assembled stories together to make meaning. And so fairy tales are actually really, really old. They're not kind of invented by Disney or even the Grimm brothers. They're ancient, and they've been told in every group, in every society, in every land. And a lot of them are the same ones. So, you know, Cinderella is repeated everywhere. Rumpelstiltskin's repeated everywhere. Chicken Licken is pretty repeated everywhere. Kind of stories that we wouldn't expect are just turn up. And so it's really kind of my interest in these sort of ancient, almost psychologies, you know, people trying to make sense and meaning of the world and how we all relate to each other. And so just when I'm really listening to someone, just kind of what am I associating to? What storyline does this feel a bit like? Is part of why I'm so interested in fairy tales.
And do you have a particular favourite children's story or fairy tale?
I mean, I'm pretty equal opportunities when it comes to fairy tales, but I think growing up, this is probably going to give away a lot about myself, but I loved The Little Mermaid. Mm-hmm. I was completely in love with the Disney version and Eric, the prince. And I just really kind of understood this story about this girl from a big family with a kind of overprotective father who wanted to go to a different world, who wanted to kind of go and explore, and she does. But to do that, she tries to change her body, and she loses her voice. She gives up her voice. And because she doesn't really understand pain, and she's told in the exchange, if you give your voice up, if you change your body, you're going to be in pain every day. But she doesn't really understand it because she's never really experienced it. So she's like, oh, it'll be fine. So she does it. And it's not fine, actually. It's really not fine. And in, the Disney version, there's a happy ever after. But the Hans Christian Andersen version, and he kind of, he took it from lots of different stories, but his version of it, the prince does not fall in love with the Little Mermaid. He falls in love with the good girl from church and goes off and marries her. And of course he would, because she can talk to him and she's actually being herself. Whereas the Little Mermaid is just this silent, very nice companion next to him who's pretending to be someone that she's not. And at the end of the Hans Christian Andersen story, she's given this opportunity. She said, well, if you get in touch with your anger and if you murder him and stand in his blood, it's really gory, then you'll be okay. But if you don't, you're going to die. And even to the end, she chooses good girl. Even right to the end, she chooses good girl, and she ends up foam and bubbles in the sea. And I'm like, oh my God, that's a cautionary tale. I know this woman, I know her. And yeah, it's huge.
I think that's a great example of how stories can change or be changed. And this has provoked in me a memory. I'm a member of a reading group, so we read books to each other, and one of the books we read was the Odyssey by Homer. And what I learned from that is that we don't know if there was anyone called Homer really. We just know there's a collection of stories, and the stories were gathered together over the course of hundreds of years from numerous different storytellers from all over the Levant, that's part of Asia that we think of as being the Middle East, and yet it's come to be thought of as being Homer's Odyssey. And of course, all of those individual stories get extracted and reproduced on the wide screen now in all kinds of hero stories, and with a slightly different slant to them.
I think, that's really powerful. I think there is a sort of a bit of a collusion around this idea that certain people invent stories, that they're attributable to one person, whereas actually, stories are the group. They're an oral tradition, and really, as culture, we're obsessed with them. If you think about, Twitter and social media and movies and Netflix, people spend so much of their time reading stories, listening to stories, and creating them. And creating different endings. And all of this is such kind of live material, isn't it, to be understood?
Absolutely. And do you think stories and metaphors share something in common with other art therapies like sound play and music?
I think music, and that's quite a kind of it speaks to something very deep, doesn't it? It's sort of non-verbal way of relating to people. It's much more body. I think stories are, in some ways, are kind of a bridge between the two. That stories put language, verbal kind of words onto these sort of bodily experiences of music, creation through sound play, where it's kind of moving objects around. So I think that there are different ways of telling stories, but I sort of think music is probably one of the deepest ways to kind of connect with people, isn't it? I imagine kind of creating musical sound happened before language.
Yeah, you may be right. We're trying to schedule a conversation with a sound play therapist, and we've had an art therapist on, but not a music therapist. It would be interesting to hear from someone who's a music therapist. Lots of traumatized people didn't have idyllic childhoods where they were read stories as they dropped off to sleep at night. What are the implications of using stories for people with traumatic or neglectful childhoods, do you think?
I think stories are really powerful in that they have to be used carefully. So I certainly do use stories. I don't know if I'd ever would just read one. It's not that I would be against it. I would just have to have a good think about it. I know, having said that, I run workshops, and in those workshops I read stories, but generally what I say to people in the reading the story part is, because they're online normally, is this is the bit where I really, if you need to kind of turn your screens off, if you need to go make a cup of tea, move your body around, just write a shopping list, half listening, because I think it can be really difficult actually to have a story read to you. There is something very intimate about it. At the same time, there's certain stories that I've been able to connect with people over and have conversations around trauma that I just don't think would have happened otherwise. There's a story of the Stone Child. It's an Inuit kind of fairy tale. I don't know if you know it.
No.
There's a Jungian analyst, Clarissa Pinkola-Estes, who reads it. So, it's beautiful. And it's this story of a child who's abandoned by their parents and left in this village. And it's winter and it's cold. And nobody will take the child in. And the child is teased, it's knocking on the doors, it's not allowed, and it's kind of humiliated, it's smelly, it's really neglected by the community. And the child finds this stone, and it just loves the stone, and it takes the stone everywhere with it, and it clings onto the stone, but the child starts fading faster and faster, and eventually kind of it sort of cries, and the last heat goes, and all its heat is going into the stone. And just in the moment that the child's dying, the stone cracks open, and this sort of magical little girl comes out, and she's the perfect partner for this child, and she takes care of the child, and she finds a home and feeds the child. And that story I've told quite a few times with people, and we've used it it's more than a few. It really resonates with a lot of people about their experience of neglect and rejection and humiliation, that comes with it. And the hopelessness as well. It's like the story's a long story, and it's really hopeless. It takes, and something in people often does have to die before anything loving and warm and new can come in. And there's different endings to the story. Sometimes they find a kind of a strange woman in her own room that kind of feeds them, and that can kind of be like, oh, is that you, Libby? Like, a bit grandiose, but the woman isn't the fairy, by the way. This fairy still comes, but these stories are a way of kind of opening into really, really painful, brutal experience without it having to be head on in your face. Let's look at your trauma, your pain, and have a chat about it. But I wouldn't just drop it in casually, I would say.
Again, I suppose that sounds a little bit like the art therapies that by using something that's related but not so in your face as a person's own history, it somehow makes it easier to take a look sideways, that makes it possible to see it.
Well, I think for lots of people, that working alongside with someone as opposed to face is just all that can be bared, really. And Yeah, and it is very similar to art therapy. I guess it is a form of it in a way. It is very similar. And but I think it's really necessary for some people.
Yeah. And there's something about making adaptations in our approaches, isn't there? In order to make them accessible, I think too easily we write off the patient as being unreachable or not able to participate, rather than thinking about what more we can do to make what we're offering palatable and something that can be engaged with.
I think it's really unusual to find someone that doesn't have a story that they like. I mean, it might not be, it might be some kind of mafia mobster story or a horror film, or, it won't necessarily be kind of Little Red Riding Hood or anything, but that most people have some kind of story that spoke to them. And my experience is that's often a way in.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned running fairy tale workshops. I believe you've also got a workshop coming up on formulation in the near future. Did you like to say something about what you're doing in that workshop?
I do. It's a kind of a newish pet project, really. So it's a series of 6 workshops. It's starting in January, and it's a series of 6 workshops. I ask people to come to all of them if they, or at least commit to all of them, even if they don't physically attend them. And it's a way of introducing kind of different psychological ideas and also kind of depth of story. So each workshop will have a therapeutic modality used to explore a particular story. So I'm just trying to, I think we do the Little Mermaid and systemic therapy. So I'm running the series at the moment, and there's the Little Mermaid and systemic therapy for that, and there's the film Get Out and Jungian analysis. And so it's a very brief description of the therapy and then a sort of deep dive into the story. And they're just really lovely spaces. They're really exciting. You don't need to be a psychologist to come to them. Just an interest in it, really. But people seem to enjoy them. I know I do.
And how do you choose your stories?
Really, I pick ones that I like. I tend to pick a story and just try and examine it. And in that examination, often what comes up is like, oh, this feels quite like a CBT kind of thing. So Harry Potter's quite CBT, and ACT is one way. Another way of holding it, it's very, very Jungian and individuation. And you just start to play with it, and you see what comes out of it. And there's normally so much. So it's quite an indulgent kind of hobby I have.
Well, you can see as we're talking to you how much you like, how much you love stories. And I suppose as you were talking, I was thinking that sounds like quite a nice way of being able to play more as you do your job. But equally, it sounds like fairy tales can be quite potent, and I'm wondering how you create safety in them. What, when you're working in a group via Zoom, how do you manage to keep people feeling safe?
Oh gosh, so I think this is the sort of group analytic training, really. So I think I'm quite careful around the frame, and what I mean by that is, we start on time, we finish on time. I'm quite clear about the structure of the session as well. So normally at the beginning, I'll just introduce people to the space, and I'll be saying, well, we're going to spend this many minutes on hellos, this bit on kind of the story, this bit on a presentation, and the rest is discussion. So there's no surprises with the frame for people. I also try and encourage kind of cameras on. Obviously, it's not always possible if people aren't well, or Wi-Fi connection, that kind of thing. But certainly just having a conversation around it, inviting people to be like, look, who's in our matrix? This is important. And then there's a sense of just, I guess, I always have an idea that anything could happen. So whilst I'm sort of holding this frame, I do try and keep an eye on the fact that anything could happen, and try and speak as honestly and directly to things as I go. So I guess that's what I can do. And I also try and keep people to task, in terms of, well, what are we reflecting on, and are we staying with the topic and the story?
So it sounds like by paying enough attention to the structure, that allows the flexibility within the process to then be able to go wherever the group needs to. And the final one, in terms of thinking about fairy tales, I mean, I tweeted you at the weekend about the Daily Mail having published an article about how younger people think fairy tales are inappropriate and outdated. Now, that could just be the Daily Mail wanting to have an attack on the woke youth. But I wondered, whether you had any thoughts on this.
I mean, I like multiple ideas about things. And so I think it's important to be skeptical of fairy tales and to be like, well, what messages are we sending people? Jack Sipes speaks like hugely about this and powerfully about it, that stories really shape our society. So we need to be very careful about what messages we're sending out. So I think, and in the workshops I run, often that's a thread in it. It's one of the interpretations that we'll have for a story is like, this is really sexist, or this is incredibly racist or offensive, and that we need to hold that in mind. At the same time, can we also hold in mind sort of, how can I put it, so a fairy tale might be kind of a literal interpretation might make it something really quite bad, but a symbolic interpretation might make it something really important. And can we hold both? Can things be literally false and symbolically true? And if you can hold the tension of that, then I think we're into something very human and very exciting. I get very nervous when there can only be one truth. There's one understanding of something. I think we're normally into trickster kind of territory there. So I wasn't a huge fan of what the Daily Mail kind of wrote, though I get it. I think we need more symbolic meaning in the world, to be honest. I think we need more metaphor. It's how we get to theory of mind. It's how we get to empathy. That we just have these sort of multiple meanings to things. And if we imagine that my thought is the only thought, or my understanding is the only understanding and the right one, then gosh, we're in trouble.
And it seems like it allows you to be quite brave in some of the conversation topics that you handle as well, just thinking about the themes of sexism and racism, for instance.
Well, I think if you can have a conversation where there is an explicit kind of welcoming of contradiction, that there is a celebration of difference. It's not difference in physicality, difference in thinking style, difference in worldview, like these things are really important. And can that be held? Then actually it's a lot easier to navigate. I mean, maybe I want to touch wood or get superstitious or something, but I've been really lucky in the spaces in that lots of complicated things have been talked about, but the culture has always been incredibly thoughtful and reflective and kind of good enough.
Okay, moving on to the third big area of your life, Libby. You also have an interesting Twitter handle, Becoming Ethical. And you've been writing about becoming more mindful of privilege and working to be more inclusive. So how did you get onto that track?
So the Twitter handle came from, there was a book, it's a manual really, it was a narrative therapy one by Alan Jenkins called Becoming Ethical, which is about men who were perpetrators of domestic violence and group work with them, and how they kind of went through this journey of becoming more conscious. And I just so kind of on a group work level, on a psychology level, it was quite important to me for a certain point in kind of my professional life, kind of working in that way. But also I think as a metaphor for how do we kind of make conscious these more shadowy parts of ourselves and hold ourselves to account, and compassion, not just, oh, I'm bad, the end, but how do we hold ourselves to account and with compassion and take responsibility for ourselves? I think, for me, that's kind of the point of therapy in lots of ways, or certainly my own therapy. And a part, I guess, of my worldview, maybe it's a bit spiritual too, about wanting to understand myself and my place in the world. So, gosh, and also I just needed a Twitter handle name. That's sort of on a really kind of reductionist way. And I thought, oh, that sounds all right. And then after a while I was like, oh God, it's a bit, something tricky in it. But anyway, so sets me up for something, I think.
Thank you. And finally, those of us who work in this field often hear very tragic stories. How do you keep yourself healthy and nourished? And this is Naomi's rather corny punchline. What advice would you give to listeners for making sure their own fairy tale has a happy ending?
Oh, I think really it's very easy to, as psychotherapists and psychologists, to over-identify with our clients' stories and with their material. I think that can be your whole life. And there is something about understanding that you are the main protagonist in your own story. and that you might need to do something more than fight other people's dragons. You might have your own wicked stepmothers to deal with, your own kind of abandoned children to go and find and rescue. And that understanding that you are more than your work, even if your work is always stage center, because it's not a criticism of loving work. It's a great thing, I think. But understanding you are more than your work is sort of incredibly necessary. So I think boundaries around work and kind of limit setting. I think also finding a way that you don't have to always suffer for work. We've got a bit of a kind of odd story around work at the moment that it's only hard work that pays results, no pain, no gain, that kind of thing, as opposed to work can actually be incredibly nourishing. Not always. You're being paid for a reason, but it can be. So I think there's something about expectations about support in work and what's reasonable or not, and people getting their eye into that. And then how do people have their own kind of happy ending to their fairy tale? I guess being able to have an ending, which I think a lot of therapists can struggle with. Because an ending is a new beginning of something else, isn't it? The stories roll on.